The word trauma has become politicized today, and we hear it more and more every single day in the news, in philosophy, in our own autobiographies. So we're going to develop a taxonomy of it here so that we can understand it, get our arms around it, move forward with some clarity. Trauma is, by definition, an overwhelming experience. Okay, so like medical doctors call something physical trauma when it overwhelms the structure of the body, as some philosophers say, as when it penetrates the envelope of the body, which is the skin, right? So a stab wound, so the metaphor goes, overwhelms the integrity of the skin so much it breaks. That's trauma, okay? A four-wheel landing on top of you, overwhelms your bones and ligaments and they break. But the mind also has a structure which, under the right amount of stress, can break. Okay, that's what psychologists use this word. They borrow this medical term, trauma, to refer to mental injuries that survivors sustain when they undergo experiences so severe that something inside them breaks. Now, this article will explain pre-traumatic qualities that can either increase or decrease one's likelihood to be traumatized, and how that likelihood interfaces with severely stressful events. So we're going to do this in terms of a couple formulas, okay? And the first formula that you need to know in order to understand trauma is the formula for resilience. Now, this is what resilience is. Resilience is control plus competence. Okay, resilience is control plus competence. Now, this is what that means. Your likelihood of being traumatized by a stressful event is basically predicated by two factors. Number one, the amount of control you have over the source of the stress. And number two, the amount of competence you have in engaging that stress. Okay, that equals your resilience, your ability to overcome a particular event. So just to sort of cite a little study that the Navy did, the Navy compared the levels of adrenocortical, which is a stress hormone, of experienced F-4B Phantom II pilots with their radar intercept officers, their RIOs, before and after landing practice. Now, the pilots who were in active or executive control of the aircraft, okay, and the RIOs were not in control. So before the flight, the RIOs who were not in control had significantly higher adrenocortical levels, but immediately after landing, it was the pilots who had higher adrenocortical levels. Now, this indicates that before the flight, those who had no control, the RIOs, were more stressed, and those who had control and competence were less stressed. They were more calm. Now, after the flight, the pilots' heightened levels of adrenocortical were likely due to the heightened focus, right? That instinct, that pressure you put on yourself to focus that is required by the event of flight, of piloting a plane. So this data was replicated in a special tactics officer recruitment selection process where prospective officers who they've taken the test before, the officer exam before, they have much lower cortisol levels than first-timers, okay? So in an officer recruitment training program, people who have already taken the officer test before have much lower cortisol levels, much lower stress physiologically than those who are first-timers, right? Because they don't know what their sense of competence is. They don't know how well they're going to handle it. They don't know how well their skill matches the task before them, okay? So this is just one more study, a third study that I'll bring up here to sort of illustrate this fact, and then we can move on. To illustrate this formula: resilience equals control plus competence. Okay, another study which took blood and urine analysis of a 12-man special forces team in southern Vietnam during the war. Okay, 2 officers and 10 enlisted men in this 12-person unit, right? And when attack was not imminent, okay? They were not about to be attacked. The officers had lower cortisol, less stress, because they thought, okay, we're not being attacked. But the enlisted men of this special forces team, so these were highly trained tactical soldiers, okay? These enlisted men, when they didn't know that an attack was coming, their cortisol levels were higher. Their stress levels were higher when an attack wasn't coming, okay? Because for the soldiers, lack of an imminent attack indicated a lack of control. But when an attack was imminent, the commanding officer's cortisol levels were raised, and the special forces operators' cortisol levels, they lowered, they dropped, because this was the domain of their control. This is that for which they trained, okay? And this control provided an opportunity to manifest their competence. And when they didn't know when they were going to be attacked, there was a lack of opportunity to manifest control and to manifest their competence. So their stress levels were higher. Okay. But even when an attack meant a threat of physical death or mutilation, the attack lowered the stress levels of the trained soldiers because attacks are what they were trained to engage. It was within their domain of competence. Therefore, when a threat arises, having competence but not control yields the experience of being overpowered. Okay? Having control but not competence yields the experience of being unprepared. Okay? In both cases, trauma likely ensues and resilience is prevented. Because remember, resilience is control plus competence. And trauma is what happens when you're not resilient enough to match the situation before you, which we're going to get to in a second, okay? So Peter Bourne, who conducted several of these studies, okay, he was the scientist behind several of the studies I just mentioned, right? He comments this, ready? He said that most members of these teams that he studied had an inordinate faith in their own capabilities. And this inordinate faith that they had in their own competence and their own capabilities and their own control and their own ability to handle stressful situations, it was too high. It was higher than it ought to have been, right? They had an inordinate faith in their own capabilities. This faith was a result of pre-existing personality traits, their very comprehensive training, and their past successful survival through the most hazardous experiences, the most dangerous experiences, right? So we'll call this combination of perceived control and perceived competence, we're going to call this resilience. That's what that is, perceived control and perceived competence over my situation, okay? The higher your perceived sense of control and competence in a situation, the higher your resilience. A situation in which you are highly competent, right, but have very little control or very little power makes resilience much more difficult. And by the same token, if you have control in a situation, but you don't know how to use that control, right, how to competently wield the power that you have in a situation to protect yourself, resilience is likewise sabotaged. Okay, so that's the first formula that I want you to have in mind. Resilience equals control plus competence, based on those studies, okay? Here's the second formula I want to sort of take in mind as we try to build a taxonomy of trauma. Ready? Trauma equals severity minus resilience, okay? So George Bonanno, who is a psychologist who specializes in resilience research at Columbia University, right, distinguishes between resilience, which is the ability to face traumatic events without being overwhelmed. And he distinguishes between resilience and recovery. Okay? Now he says this. Bonanno says that recovery, it connotes a trajectory in which normal functioning, it gives way to threshold or sub-threshold psychopathology, which is PTSD, basically, a traumatic dysregulation, okay? So recovery connotes a trajectory in which normal functioning gives way to trauma and then bounces back. That's what recovery is, okay? Resilience isn't bouncing back from trauma. Resilience, according to Bonanno, is never having been traumatized at all by the experience, okay? So a lot of people usually misuse that term resilience to say, hey man, you need to be resilient and come back from this traumatic experience. No, Bonanno says that is recovery. Resilience is having enough control and competence never to have experienced an overwhelming event as traumatic in the first place, okay? So resilience is what mitigates against you experiencing a stressful event as traumatic at all. Recovery is the attempt to return to normal when a lack of resilience has knocked you out of psychological equilibrium into something like PTSD, or traumatic dysregulation or something like that. Okay. So how does resilience interface with the events themselves, which could be potentially traumatic, right? How does resilience interface with these events? Well, we'll call the objective stressfulness of the event, we'll call that considered outside psychological factors. We'll call the objective stressfulness of the event, we will call that severity, okay? The objective stressfulness of event is the severity of an event, okay? Stubbing your toe is low in severity, right? It might feel approximately high, but it's pretty low, right? Child sexual abuse or combat fatigue is very high in severity, right? And it has very prolonged effects that need a long time to unpack for many people, okay? So an individual's resilience may be higher or lower. So lower resilience means that more events will be potentially traumatic. So the less competence and the less control you have in overall in life, the more likely overwhelming experiences will be to be traumatic, and the more likely it is that you will experience more traumatic events. So in other words, an individual with lower resilience either has less control or less competence than he needs to handle the severity of the situations that life has given him. And an individual with higher resilience can handle more stressful events. So the effects of psychological trauma then are similar to the effects of physical trauma. So you can't just use the thing that was broken again right away, right? So you might, for example, if you get stabbed by somebody with a knife, that your skin won't be resilient to that knife, right? But if somebody stabbed you with like a plastic, takeout fork, maybe if you had really weak skin, it might puncture your skin, but your skin is probably resilient enough to resist that plastic takeout fork, or let's say a plastic takeout spork, right? Your skin's probably resilient enough to overcome the potentially traumatic event of being stabbed with a takeout spork. But let's say you just get stabbed with like a Kershaw knife, right? Your skin's probably not going to be resilient enough. And so you can't just use the broken thing again. The problem with trauma then, like being stabbed, isn't just that something bad happened, but that a wound now endures as a physical and mental artifact of the traumatic event. Trauma is not just a past event which has occurred, which we need to mentally overcome. It is an enduring wound from which we need to heal strategically. Okay? So you can't just use the thing that was traumatized again right away. You have to rehabilitate it. Okay? If you start to try to use it right away, it's going to take longer and longer and longer to fix. So you have to become curious about your pain. Ouch, that really hurt. Hurts when I do this. How does this pain inform my strategy for healing my particular wound? And it's very difficult to quantify resilience, right? It may even ebb and flow for a single person, season to season, day to day, situation to situation. So for example, Cato the Younger, I think I mentioned him before. He's a first century BC Stoic philosopher and a military commander. Cato believed that grief was impurity. Grief over tragedy in life was an impurity of the mind. It was a weakness that only the unthoughtful and unthinking people suffer. And he was highly competent, and he maintained a high degree of control in severely stressful situations. And he would just stand in the snow naked for days just to grow his resilience, his ability to mentally handle severe stress, right? Very mentally strong guy. Very mentally strong. But then his brother died, and his life was changed. He didn't abandon his philosophy, but all of a sudden, this humble stoic who was devoted to living a life that wasn't full of flashy things and living a life that was devoted to reason and logic and order and not giving in to your passions, all of a sudden, he was in his room weeping for weeks. He wasn't visiting his men on the battlefield. He spent over half his fortune on the funeral of his brother and memory of his brother. And he became lost in his sadness. And one of the most difficult aspects of trauma is that it can happen in any sphere of life without notice, right? So for Cato, he was a guy who was highly competent, devoted his entire life to developing mental resilience. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, flanked by life, out of nowhere. He could not have prepared for it. He could not have known. He did everything he could, still experienced overwhelm, still experienced tragedy and evil so great that he could not deal. And that's often how trauma happens. So few people make it through life without having their minds ripped apart by grief or abuse or overwhelming evil. And it is impossible to have enough control or competence to protect yourself from trauma completely. It's impossible to be so resilient that you'll be protected from the deepest pain that you're scared even to imagine. It's impossible to be so competent and in so much control and so powerful that you will be protected from the pain of which you are most fearful. But this is where recovery comes in, as Bonanno calls it. And this is where the beginning of resilience must occur. We must develop our competencies, we must develop our control, and then on the other hand, we must develop the skills of recovery, which is another issue entirely. But for now, we have developed a basic taxonomy of what trauma is, why it occurs, and it is the overwhelm of our combined control and competence by the severity of an event. That's what trauma is. And there are many more things we could say, but for now, we have taken one step toward using trauma in a way that is less ambiguous and politically charged than it is often used today.